Hi, I'm David DiCerto from Castletown Media. Grab your wooden stakes as I'll be taking a look at Nosferatu through a Catholic lens. Ever since its release on Christmas Day, Nosferatu has been written about and talked about by film critics and cultural commentators, including a number of those from a faith-based perspective. So I thought I'd weigh in. Directed by Robert Eggers, the film, which surprised at the box office and has garnered a number of Oscar nominations, is a remake of the 1922 silent vampire classic subtitled A Symphony of Horror by German expressionistic filmmaker F.W. Murnau. The only horror movie, by the way, to make the Vatican's 1995 list of 45 important films. Murnau's Nosferatu, which is an archaic Romanian word for vampire, borrowed liberally from, well, basically ripped off Bram Stoker's novel Dracula, to the extent that Stoker's widow, Florence, a Catholic convert, sued for copyright infringements, leading to a court ordering all copies of the film be destroyed. A few prints survived, and like a vampire, Nosferatu rose from the dead and is now considered a masterpiece of silent cinema, having been made once prior, back in 1979, by fellow German filmmaker Werner Herzog. The 1922 original also inspired a young Robert Eggers, who says he's been dreaming about this project ever since watching a bad VHS copy of the film as a 9-year-old boy. And I must say, he's a good fit for the job, having established himself as a strong visual storyteller, with such films as The Witch, The Lighthouse, and The Northman, all demonstrating a flair for evocative imagery. This is a film, however, that left me conflicted. Eggers, unquestionably a talented and intelligent filmmaker, has crafted one of the more interesting horror pictures of recent memory. It's a movie that kept me thinking about it, a rarity in our age of disposable entertainment, where I often forget most movies before the final credits finish rolling. Though much of what I've been thinking about is what didn't sit well with me. Before we dive in, if you enjoy these videos, please subscribe to Castletown Media on YouTube by clicking the subscribe button below. Okay, so anyone familiar with Stoker's Dracula pretty much already knows the plot here. Only the names and settings have changed, from Victorian England to the fictional German town of Wisborg. But beyond their surface similarities, Stoker's novel and Nosferatu are quite different. For those who haven't read Stoker's Dracula or watched any of the film adaptations, a young, newly married solicitor, Thomas Hutter rather than Jonathan Harker in Stoker's tale, played by Nicholas Hoult, is sent by his real estate firm to far-off Transylvania to close a deal with a mysterious nobleman, here named Count Orlock rather than Count Dracula, who wants to purchase property in Hutter's hometown, the aforementioned Wisborg. Hutter's melancholy new bride named Ellen, not Mina, played by Lily Rose Depp, daughter of Johnny Depp, pleads with him not to go, troubled by dark premonitions. But being an ambitious and thoroughly enlightened modern man, he heads off to the Carpathian Mountains where, against the advice of the superstitious locals, he meets the creepy recluse and seals both the deal and the fate of Wisborg, where Orlock ultimately arrives, along with a ship full of plague-infected rats and an insatiable thirst for blood. This movie had me hooked from the moment I saw its stylistic trailer, and visually, the film doesn't disappoint. Its gothic tone eerily echoes Murnau's original, while giving it a cinematically chilling aesthetic all its own. Hutter's first nightmarish encounter with Orlock is brilliantly disorienting. A real fever dream. I wouldn't be surprised if it takes home the Oscar for Best Cinematography. While artful in its use of shadows and light and other spooky atmospherics to create a more psychological sense of dread, squeamish viewers beware. The film does have some scary sequences and disturbing, at times bloody images, including one involving young children. There's also sexual content with some nudity, so it's clearly for grown-ups, and maybe not for all of them at that. But for those who do choose to watch it, the film is a mixed bag that from a Catholic perspective, offers mature viewers a lot to, well, sink their fangs into. In my opinion, Eggers course corrects one of the problematic aspects of vampire films in general, which goes all the way back to Todd Browning's iconic 1931 Dracula, starring Bela Lugosi.
I am Dracula.
In fact, it goes back even further to the vampire literature of the 18th century Romantics. The transformation over time of vampires from the damned fiends of folklore to brooding, Byronic antiheroes. After that, turning into a bat seems like a cheap parlor trick.
My name is a big bat.
It's a troubling trend that's only gotten worse over the decades. Vampires, at least the Hollywood variety, have always had a romanticized air of mystery about them, the seductive allure of false immortality. Despite something sinister lurking beneath their suave sophistication, Lugosi, dressed to the nines with his cape and hypnotic glare, and later Christopher Lee, still cut dashing figures. Flash forward a few decades, and vampires went from well-groomed monsters to outright matinee idols in films like The Hunger, The Lost Boys, and Interview with a Vampire starring Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt.
You just have to try and keep up.
Reaching their vampire chic zenith with hit TV series like HBO's True Blood and the Underworld and Twilight movie franchises, with legions of young female fans baring their necks to be on heartthrob Robert Pattinson's Team Edward. Being undead never looked so good. Vampires were still dangerous, but also hip and chic and sexy. In a word, cool. What they weren't? Accursed, diabolical creatures of unmitigated metaphysical evil. It says something about our culture. What had been detestable becomes desirable. That is until this film. Here, Count Orlock, played by a barely recognizable Bill Skarsgård, is unambiguously satanic.
There is a devil in this world, and I have met him.
Skarsgård had to endure 6 hours of makeup each day to apply heavy prosthetics to transform him into a decomposing, maggot-riddled corpse of demonic origin. He even consulted a Mongolian vocal coach to alter his voice and achieve a ghoulish octave. A far cry from his brother Alexander's blood-sucking bad boy hunk Eric in True Blood. Setting this tone from the get-go, the film opens in flashback, with a younger, lonely Ellen calling out at night in desperation to any spirit who will come to her in her desolation. She quickly learns a costly spiritual lesson. Be careful what or who you invite into your life. As a demon responds, an incubus that manifests itself in the reanimated body of a dead Romanian nobleman who practiced black magic, Count Orlock, who torments her from afar through night terrors. Ironically, Skarsgård himself admitted in an interview that it took him a while to shake off the demon he had conjured in preparing for his role. He may have meant it metaphorically, or not, but it echoes the experience of Christian author C.S. Lewis, who suffered a similar infernal malaise after writing the Screwtape Letters, for which he had spent months trying to get inside the head of a devil, against the counsel of his friend and fellow author J.R.R. Tolkien, a Catholic who had warned Lewis of the dangers of getting too close, like Ellen, to dark spiritual forces. We later find out the contract Hutter's employer gives him to get signed by the Count is actually a demonic pact binding Ellen to Orlock, whose purpose for traveling to Visborg is actually to possess her body and soul. I am an appetite, nothing more, Orlock says at one point, an insightful description of sin. On the way to Orlock's castle, coincidentally, the same one used in the 1979 version, Hutter stops at an inn where the peasants' warnings fall on deaf ears, a deafness later afflicting other ears back in Visborg. Now, Eggers is touching on something important that a number of other Christian film reviewers have also picked up on, including Orthodox Christian author Rod Dreher in his excellent Substack article on the film. The idea that enlightened modernity is powerless to confront true evil because it refuses to acknowledge its spiritual dimension. As Baudelaire wrote, the greatest trick the devil ever pulled was making the world think he didn't exist. Willem Dafoe, who ironically played Count Orlock in the quirky 2000 film Shadow of a Vampire, well, actually he played Max Schreck, the German actor who played Orlock in the silent film.
I'd like some makeup.
Anyway, here he plays Professor von Franz, an expert on the occult who, like Stoker's Dr. Van Helsing, is enlisted to help defeat Orlock. At one point, he says,
"We have not become so much enlightened as we have been blinded by the gaseous light of science. I have wrestled with the devil as Jacob wrestled the angel in Penuel, and I tell you, if we are to tame darkness, we must first face that it exists."
Great line, and a pretty astute diagnosis of postmodernity's metaphysical macular degeneration. The film seems to be offering a wake-up call to our enlightened scientific age that has deluded itself into thinking it has all the answers. It's not saying that science is bad, but a scientism based on an imperious materialist rationalism that refuses to acknowledge, to paraphrase Hamlet, there's more things in heaven and earth than are dreamt of in secular lecture halls or Silicon Valley or, apparently, Visborg. The kind of scientific fundamentalism that has no room for mystery and sets out to create a disenchanted world bereft of spiritual realities, where, as the poet Wordsworth put it, we murder to dissect, or, as Stoker's Van Helsing says, a science that, quote, wants to explain all, and if it explains not, then it says there is nothing to explain, end quote. Dreher puts it this way: when faced with spiritual evil, quote, all the powers of the scientific materialist world can do nothing about it, aside from giving people the false assurance that everything is under control, that there are no monsters under the bed. But sometimes there really are, and only uneducated fools fail to see them, end quote. But it's not just the uneducated fools of Visborg. Even proper pious characters like Ellen's friend Anna, who say their prayers, don't prove very effective. Who does? Well, those superstitious peasants, and an Eastern Orthodox priest who performs an exorcism on Hutter after he escapes Orlock's castle and is brought to a monastery by nuns. Perhaps Eggers is attempting to contrast an authentic faith rooted in sacramental mystery with a religiosity that, again, quoting Dreher, treats God, quote, like a cosmic butler whose role is to make sure the house, so to speak, is in good order, a puny form of faith whose role is to spiritualize the middle-class materialist order and to serve as a psychological prop for the bourgeois, end quote. So, on the one hand, I commend Eggers. It's not often that a movie, rather than mocking a more traditional brand of Christianity, actually shows it to be efficacious. But this also brings me to my conflictedness, and to why, ultimately, the film left a bad taste in my mouth. And I'm not alone. Others, like Dreher and my good friend Deacon Stephen Greydonis, have also pointed out how, while religion is laced throughout Nosferatu, unlike in Stoker's Dracula, it's not faith or God in any traditional biblical sense that saves the day, but something else. Dracula was clearly a Victorian story about good versus evil, and not just in the generic sense, but specifically a metaphysical, diabolical evil being confronted and ultimately defeated by Christian and, one could argue, Catholic faith.
Indeed.
Here, the contest is between evil and occultism, embodied by the character of von Franz, who calls upon angels and demons for assistance and is more an alchemist than a Christian believer, like Stoker's Van Helsing, who charged his fellow vampire slayers to be Knights of the Cross, and who relied on God, divine grace, and the sacraments for victory. none of which have much of a cameo in this film's final resolution. Unlike Murnau, who traveled in occult circles, Eggers has made comments in interviews that he fears the occult and that he envies the medieval craftsmen who did their work for God. So it's odd that he would make the occult the means of defeating the demonic Orlock, especially since it's kind of what got Ellen in trouble in the first place. As Dreher succinctly puts it, it's like Eggers is presenting, quote, an occult solution to an occult problem, end quote. Or, if you will, it's like fighting hellfire with hellfire. And you know what they say about playing with fire, which brings me to the film's climax. Now, I spent a portion of a dinner with my friend Deacon Greydonis scrutinizing the ending. Nothing like discussing bloodsuckers over a glass of red wine. I wish you could have joined us. Deacon Stevens' analysis was, as usual, brilliant, especially his take on the finale's unsettling conflation of sex and death. I should have him on the podcast. As in both the 1922 original and the 1979 remake, Ellen must, spoiler alert, sacrifice herself at the end by luring Orlock to her bedchamber and keeping him there until sunrise, when dawn's light destroys him. A marked difference from Stoker's climax. Look, the ending of the earlier two versions certainly had sexual undertones to the extent permitted for their times, but they both suggested a more traditional, one could say, Christian act of self-sacrifice. Here the scene is a more eroticized and paganized blood ritual, with Dreher describing Ellen as, quote, an occult Christ figure, end quote, and even left him asking, quote, why not the real Christ, end quote. I agree. Defoe's character even tells Ellen she could have been a high priestess of Isis if she had lived in earlier times. The whole ending is a frustrating and problematic head-scratcher in a largely intriguing film, punctuated, ironically, by the peal of a church bell. Though theologically flawed in its own way, Francis Ford Coppola's 1992 Bram Stoker's Dracula, which Eggers said influenced his film, ends on a more redemptive note. Here, as others have pointed out, the victory doesn't feel like one. Stephen King, a guy who knows a thing or two about the genre, said horror movies don't love death, they love life. You'd be hard-pressed to agree watching this film. Now, there's a whole coffin full of other stuff to unpack that I wish we had more time to talk about. How Eggers' use of shadow to reveal Orlock could be seen as an Augustinian understanding of evil as an absence of reality. Or the film's themes of free will, sexual repression. Or its tagline, succumb to darkness. A curious choice for a Christmas release. But one last observation. A lot of folks have pointed out the film's fascination with death. Ellen's character even describes herself being so happy in a dream in which she is surrounded by death, a reaction both highly disturbing yet quite apropos of the perverse celebratory attitude of many towards our own culture of death. In his 1999 letter to artists, St. John Paul II noted, even when they explore the darkest depths of the soul, or the most unsettling aspects of evil, artists give voice, in a way, to the universal desire for redemption. While that desire is hinted at in this film, in its grasping for the light, Nosferatu, as its tagline tempts, unfortunately succumbs to darkness. For even more analysis of Nosferatu, I encourage you to check out Rod Dreher's full article in Substack. And if you want to read Bram Stoker's Dracula, I recommend the Ignatius Press Critical Edition, which has some great Catholic commentaries that were super helpful in me understanding key themes of that novel. Until next time, I'm David DiCerto, and this is The Catholic Lens. And don't miss a single episode of The Catholic Lens. Follow us on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. And for full videos of our film reviews, subscribe to Castletown Media on YouTube. Stay connected and join the conversation in the comments.